So I decided I was going to write a parliamentary brief. After reviewing Bill C-22, the Liberals' latest attempt at a lawful access bill, and listening to what companies like Meta told committee, the concerns have become very clear. This bill does not simply fix a warrant process. It could quietly force companies to build access capabilities, retain more data, and then legally prevent them from telling Canadians what they did. So I did what we always tell Canadians to do. I went to the source, read the bill, and submitted a parliamentary brief of my own. Let's take a look. Before we get into what I wrote, I'm going to show you what the government wrote, everybody. So, this is House of Commons of Canada, Bill C-22, an act respecting lawful access. I'm not sure if it's actually respecting it, but, that's something else entirely. So this is under the Minister of Public Safety, Gary Anandasangari. So we're going to go through just a few parts of this, and these are what I believe are the most concerning parts, because it is rather a long bill. So many of the concerns actually reside in part 2. Core providers. So this says, the governor in council may make regulations respecting the obligations of core providers, including regulations respecting the development, implementation, assessment, testing, and maintenance of operational and technical capabilities, including capabilities related to extracting and organizing information that is authorized to be accessed and to providing access to such information to authorized persons. B, the installation, use, operation, management, assessment, testing, and maintenance of any device, equipment, or other thing that may enable an authorized person to access information. C, notices to be given to the minister or other persons, including with respect to any capability referred to in paragraph A, and any device, equipment, or other thing referred to in paragraph B. Now, we're going to stop there. What is that? Well, ladies and gentlemen, this, quite simply, is what Google and Meta and some of these other companies have been very concerned about. This is essentially the government saying to these companies, you must implement some sort of technology or device to be able to collect information. And that's what you have to do. So notice that it says, or other thing. I love these technical terms that are put into these pieces of legislation. You can tell IT guys didn't write it. So they essentially are saying, in order to actually get the information that we need to, that we're requiring out of this act, you need to slot something in that can actually take that information, collect it, because we need to be able to actually access something in order to get it. That's what that says. This is what Meta and Google have been sounding the alarm about, but we'll come back to that. Now, going down to D, the retention of categories of metadata, including transmission data as defined in section 487.011 of the Criminal Code for reasonable periods of time not exceeding 1 year. So, wants to collect all of this metadata. Now, it's not that it's necessarily going to be used, but it's got to be stored. And it doesn't really define by who. Doesn't say this is Canadians. It could be a lot of different people. So I don't even know if this part has been brought up as of yet, but there's going to be concerns brought up from no doubt other jurisdictions and other countries about Canada having potential access to information about people that aren't even its citizens. Remember the whole Snowden whistleblower stuff that went on years ago? Yeah, reactions like that. So that's the first part of this. It kind of sets everything else up, because this is the whole instrument of data collection that the government wants these companies to actually implement. Ministerial orders. Subject to Section 8, the minister may make an order with respect to an electronic service provider, and the order may contain any provision that may be contained in a regulation made under subsection 5.2, whether or not the provider is a core provider. The order must specify the period during which it has effect. This essentially is saying that the minister can make any such order that's in this act and direct them to do anything, regardless of whether they're telecommunications companies Could be WhatsApp, could be a Google game developer that one guy wrote. This is the challenge that is going on with this actual bill, because it is so vague and is so broad that it allows a lot of this extra detail to be decided without a vote. That's the main concern here. You know, the CRTC is raising the fees for Netflix and Disney and all of these other streaming providers by a factor of 3, and there's not any vote in Parliament on it. Yeah, that's how that happens, because these types of provisions get put into the bill. So someone gets to decide the actual detail of what this legislation is after the fact, and it doesn't have to go to a vote in the House. It doesn't have to be studied in committee, doesn't have to go back to the House, and it doesn't get to be studied and voted on in the Senate either. Confidentiality, prohibition on disclosure. This is a big problem, folks. An electronic service provider and any person acting on its behalf must not disclose any of the following information except as permitted under this Act or the Canada Evidence Act. A. Information contained in an order made under subsection 6 or 7. B. Information on which the minister relied in making the order. C. The fact that the electronic service provider is subject to the order. D. Information provided in the course of representations made under section 8 or in any response given by the minister, and the fact that the minister has invited the representations. E. Information contained in an application referred to in subsection 6 or in a decision made under subsection 6.4. F. Information submitted under subsection 11.2 and any information received from the minister in response. Or G. Any prescribed information. The companies can't disclose anything. Now, if you want to hear what a company like Meta actually says or thinks about this type of clause in the government legislation, you don't have to wonder, because they were at committee back in early May, and this is the Conservatives questioning Meta on what they think about sections like this in Bill C-22.
Ms. Curran, I brought it up in another witness that does Meta advertise its privacy controls to its consumers?
We do. Yeah, we have a transparency center that outlines all of our privacy policies. We implement essentially privacy by design into all of our products, and we make that very clear to all of our users what our policies are.
So if you were to receive a secret ministerial order to install a device or create a capability for law enforcement to circumvent those advertised privacy controls, how would you be able to tell your users that those things that you're advertising are no longer allowable?
We wouldn't, and this is a major issue. I'm going to let my colleague Robin go into this in more detail, because this is an important question.
Yeah, thank you so much for putting this question forward. Ultimately, as drafted, the bill has a blanket secrecy provision that would essentially prevent us from being able to explain to our users that these changes had been made, or if discovered, why they had been made. And I think this latter part is really important, because ultimately our services are available around the world, and that means that there are security researchers and technical experts and journalists around the world who regularly decompile and reverse engineer our products. Sometimes it's because they're trying to look for vulnerabilities and help us shore up our systems through like bug bounty programs. Sometimes it's because they're trying to see if they can get any information on what our next, product and feature releases are going to be. This happens for all companies like ours. And so ultimately, these kinds of changes will be discovered. It's not a question of if. It's sort of, as Rachel was saying, just like the exploitation of a vulnerability would be a question of when, the discoverability of this would also be a question of when. And then providers are in a really significant conflict, because our users would completely lose trust in the security and privacy protections of our products.
So imagine this. You sign up for Facebook. You agree to its privacy policy. And you're of the understanding that your privacy is actually going to be taken seriously. Facebook then gets a order from a minister after C-22 passes in its current condition, where they have to introduce a device or technology to actually capture all of the information that is going on with any user on Facebook, which includes Facebook chats and messages and everything like that. Browsing history, what you've looked at, what you've watched, whatever, and what you've posted. What they're saying, and it's correct, is that they would not be able to then amend their privacy policy to let users know that that happened because of that secrecy order. So they immediately become in conflict with their own privacy policy that they've given to their users. And then what they're saying is, when it eventually comes out, and it will, that's the saying that we use in IT security, is it's not a matter of if, it's when, that this is there, it's going to tick off a lot of users. And it's not going to be just for Facebook. That's the problem. And this is what they're saying. And this is the big problem. Well, it's one of the big problems with this bill. The other issue is that when you're putting these devices in, that actually breaks encryption. And this has been talked a little bit about out there, and no doubt other people have talked about it. But so what ends up happening is, let's say you're sending an email through the Google system. So you're sending that email. As soon as you're emailing that, Google encrypts that, and it keeps it encrypted, and it delivers it, and then it stops. And then after it's delivered, the subsequent system decrypts that, and you're actually allowed to see what is in that message. And while that's encrypted in transit, that allows a lot of these data capture malicious technologies out there. It keeps your data safe. The problem is when you have a device that breaks that encryption cycle, well, now there's a vulnerability. Now there's a point between A and B, because now there's A, B, and C, where malicious actors can potentially grab all of that information out of said device. This is what Google and all of these other companies are waving their arms about and saying, we're not going to be doing that. Sorry, because we can't advertise end-to-end encryption when it's not end-to-end encryption, can we? So just want to make sure that we put that out there. You can make your encryption as strong as you want, but if you have a gap when you're trying to send data from point A to point B, and now you've added a third point where there is no encryption in there by design, that's a problem. Systemic vulnerability. Okay, so this sounds kind of nice, but we'll get to that. The electronic service provider is not required to comply with the provision of the order with respect to an electronic service if compliance with that provision would require the provider to introduce a systemic vulnerability related to that service or prevent the provider from rectifying such a vulnerability. Well, that sounds all well and good, but how does the Act define a systemic vulnerability? I'm glad you asked. It's under definitions. It means a vulnerability in the electronic protections of an electronic service that creates a substantial risk that secure information can be accessed by a person who does not have any right or authority to do so. So the issue here is, who gets to decide what counts as a systemic vulnerability? Because the government could just say, well, no, whatever you're saying doesn't count, so thank you very much. And then they have to comply with the order. So, and this is kind of the issue, because based on the secrecy, I don't even know if the company would be able to even challenge that in court, because that would be making that public. So can they even challenge what they're being asked to do under the secrecy provision of this act if they disagree with it? This is a big problem, folks. Because if the government just gets to decide what a systemic vulnerability is, and they get to define it, and they get to be the adjudicator as to what constitutes a systemic vulnerability, then even if Google and Apple and Meta, they say, hey, listen, you're asking me to introduce this device collection thing, you literally call it a thing, that's going to introduce a vulnerability in the system. And then the government says, no, it's not. We don't accept that definition. We don't accept that that's going to be a systemic vulnerability. You have to implement it anyway. This is the concern. Production order, subscriber information. On ex parte application made by a peace officer or public officer, a justice or judge may order a person who provides services to the public to prepare and produce a document containing all the subscriber information that relates to any information, including transmission data that is specified in the order and that is in their possession or control when they receive the order. Before making the order, the justice or judge must be satisfied by information on oath in Form 5.004 that there be a reasonable ground to suspect that an offense has been or will be committed under this act or any other act of Parliament, and the subscriber information is in the person's possession or control and will assist in the investigation of the offense. This is very vague, folks, because why do you need all subscriber information? Why? And you have reasonable grounds to suspect an offense will be committed? What does that even mean? So a lot of the concerns that have been brought forth about this section is that this kind of really lowers the bar on production order requirements. And it introduces potential data distribution of folks in that data set that have nothing to do with the alleged investigation at hand. That's a problem. A peace officer or public officer may make a demand in form, and this demand is a warrantless demand. That's let's just be clear what that is, to a telecommunications service provider, requiring them to confirm within the time and in the manner specified in the demand whether or not they provide or have provided telecommunication services to any subscriber or client, or to any account or identifier specified in the demand. Peace officer or public officer may make the demand only if they have reasonable grounds to suspect that an offense has been or will be committed under this act or any other act of Parliament, and the confirmation that is demanded will assist in the investigation of the offense. The peace officer or public officer who makes the demand may impose conditions in the demand prohibiting the disclosure of its existence or some or all of its contents for a period not greater than 1 year after the day on which the demand is made. The peace officer or public officer may impose the conditions only if they have reasonable grounds to believe that the disclosure during the period would jeopardize the conduct of the investigation of the offense to which the demand relates. So again, this is a privacy issue, folks. They don't need a warrant for this. And they can impose, by themselves, they can impose a secrecy clause up to a year. Why don't we just get a warrant, folks? Why? Why don't we fix the process to get a warrant? What's the issue? Publicly available information for greater certainty. No production order or warrant or confirmation of service demand made under Section 47.0121 is necessary for a peace officer or public officer to receive, obtain, and act on any information that is available to the public. So on the surface, this seems probably pretty reasonable, because if you can just go and get something that is in the public domain, what's the problem? Well, here's the problem. There's a lot of services out there that allow you to just generally view different pieces of information. So if you go on Facebook and you have your account, you can view a lot of information on a lot of different profiles if it's available. But there's a big difference between somebody going through and searching for, John Q, whatever, and screenshotting that information that's in the public domain, versus going to Meta and saying, I want all the public information that is available for everybody named John Q, etc. And that's what this allows them to do. So going on Facebook and screenshotting one person's profile, not a problem, because that's what police officers do today. But allowing them to just aggregate the entire data set, they could potentially ask for, give me every single user on Facebook, because that's public, as long as the people have set their privacy settings accordingly on Facebook. And it's not just Facebook. It's Facebook, it's YouTube, any social media platform that you like. So again, it's the mass collection of data that is unreasonable, and it doesn't make sense. So this brings us to where I said, okay, time to submit a brief. This is in my wheelhouse. I spent 20 years in IT, many of it helping to design infrastructure for corporations. So I decided I was going to write a parliamentary brief. It says, submitted to Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security, submitted by Ryan Davies, former Chief Information Officer, perspective 20 years of experience in process design, organizational design, infrastructure, architecture, information systems, cyber risk, and public sector technology operations. So I'm not going to take you through the whole thing because it is long, but this is the executive summary. So what I say here is that from the perspective of a chief information officer, the big problem that I see that C-22 is trying to solve is that it's trying to solve a process issue with technology. And this is all too common. And I say here, Bill C-22 appears to diagnose a process problem, namely timely access to warrants, orders, and lawful assistance, and then attempts to solve it by changing technology, architecture, security posture, and data retention obligations. Mature IT governance does the opposite. Frameworks such as ITIL, COBIT, and Lean Six Sigma begin with root cause analysis, process clarity, governance, controls, measurement, and continuous improvement. Technology is then applied to support an optimized process. So what this bill does is it says, listen, police are having problems getting access to information in a timely manner. It takes too long to get a warrant. So we're going to make it a lot easier to get that warrant, and we're going to make it a lot easier to get that information. But you have to do so very, very carefully. And if you want this information stored, there's even ways to do that carefully. But they haven't done this carefully. They haven't done the work that you need in order to actually implement this. And this is where IT folks get very frustrated with government. Because all too often they will draft legislation knowing almost nothing about the technology and environment in which they are implementing said legislation. There seems to be no consultation, or if there is, the consultation is completely ignored because it's too difficult. Well, when it comes to invading someone's privacy, that should be difficult. It shouldn't be impossible. There should be reasonable courses of action that law enforcement should be able to take in order to pursue an investigation. I think Canadians can agree on that. The problem is what this is not reasonable. It's unreasonable. And it's what these companies are trying to say to the government. This is unreasonable. And companies such as Signal, they're threatening to leave if this bill is implemented as is. But here's the brief. It is long, and I don't have a link to it yet, but what I can tell you is this was submitted to the Public Safety and National Security Parliamentary Committee. And here's the email that I received from them. So they do have it. It is in the process of being translated. You may be asking, will I be called to testify in committee? I have no idea if I'll be called to testify in committee. That's all going to depend on when they read my brief. I do talk about being a chief information officer for a federal agency. I talk about some of the concerns that I have based on the government's own processes, based on the government's own IT maturity, based on the government's own internal lack of transparency, even between agencies and the government's IT organization. So I think there is some valid information and discussion to have, but they may already know a lot of this, right? They have a lot of information at their disposal. But, I thought it prudent to give my input on this and my perspective just from a perspective of a concerned Canadian that has a lot of experience within IT. Now, the good news is that all of this pressure and all of this backlash coming from these companies and Canadians, it's had an effect. A bunch of people probably already know about this, but a couple days ago, this came out, Liberals to amend police data interception bill following searing criticism. Big Tech has piled on concerns about Bill C-22, along with privacy advocates. So what Gary has said is that he's willing to amend the bill and kind of pare down and address some of these concerns. Well, we'll see. We will see. There's going to be more discussion on this. But then it also came out that he wants this rammed through before the end of June. That would be crazy to introduce amendments, go through those amendments, analyze them, get the feedback from relevant witnesses, then send this back to the House of Commons, vote on the amendments, send it to the Senate, have them look at this, and then have them pass this into law. You want that all done? Are you kidding, Gary? When you're talking about laws like this, that fundamentally can have a dramatic and lasting negative impact on privacy, these are not the bills you ram through the House of Commons. These are bills that you take time to study carefully, to understand the impact, and to ensure that you get it right. Because the price of getting it wrong can be catastrophic.